Walk to Moons, Chapter 6. Blackberries. What was the diabolical thing that happened to Mr. Cadaver? Gramps asked. You didn't tell us that yet. I explained that just as Phoebe was going to divulge the purely awful thing that had happened to Mr. Cadaver, her father came home from work, and we all sat down to dinner. Me, Phoebe, Mr. and Mrs. Winterbottom, and Phoebe's sister Prudence. Phoebe's parents reminded me a lot of my other grandparents, the Pickfords. Like the Pickfords, Mr. and Mrs. Winterbottom spoke quietly, in short sentences, and sat straight up as they ate their food. They were extremely polite to each other, saying, "Yes, Norma," and "Yes, George," and "Would you please pass the potatoes, Phoebe?" and "Wouldn't you, your guest, like another helping?" They were picky about their food. Everything they ate was what my father would call side dishes: potatoes, zucchini, bean salad, mystery casserole that I could not identify. They didn't eat meat. They didn't use butter. They were very much concerned with cholesterol. From what I could gather, Mr. Winterbottom worked in an office, creating road maps. Mrs. Winterbottom baked and cleaned and did laundry and grocery shopping. I had a funny feeling that Mrs. Winterbottom did not actually like all this baking and cleaning and laundry and shopping, and I'm not quite sure why I had that feeling, because if you just listened to the words she said, it sounded as if she was Mrs. Supreme Housewife. For example, at one point, Mrs. Winterbottom said, "I believe I've made more pies in the past week than I can count." She said this in a cheery voice, but afterward, in a small silence, when no one commented on her pies, she gave a soft sigh and looked down at her plate. I thought it was odd that she baked all those pies when she seemed so concerned about cholesterol. A little later, she said, "I couldn't find exactly that brand of muesli you like so much, George, but I bought something similar." Mr. Winterbottom kept eating, and again, in that silence, Mrs. Winterbottom sighed and examined her plate. I was happy for her when she announced that since Phoebe and Prudence were back in school, she thought she would return to work. Apparently, during the school terms, she worked part-time at Rocky's Rubber as a receptionist. When no one commented on her going back to work, she sighed again and poked her potatoes. A few times Mrs. Winterbottom called her husband Sweetie Pie and Honey Bun. She said, "Would you like more zucchini, Sweetie Pie? And did I make enough potatoes, Honey Bun?" For some reason that surprised me, those little names she used. She was dressed in a plain brown skirt and white blouse. On her feet were sensible wide flat shoes. She did not wear makeup, even though she had a pleasant round face and a long curly yellow hair. The main impression I got was that she was used to being plain and ordinary, that she was not supposed to do anything too shocking. And Mr. Winterbottom was playing the role of father with a capital F. He sat at the head of the table with his white shirt cuffs rolled back neatly. He still wore his red and blue striped tie. His expression was serious, his voice was deep, and his words were clear. "Yes, Norma," he said deeply and clearly. "No, Norma." He looked more like 52 than 38, but this was not something I would ever call to his or Phoebe's attention. Phoebe's sister Prudence was 17 years old, but she acted like her mother. She ate primly, she nodded politely, and she smiled after everything she said. It all seemed peculiar. They acted so thumpingly tidy and respectable. After dinner, Phoebe walked me home. She said, You wouldn't think it to look at her, but Mrs. Cadaver is as strong as an ox." Phoebe looked behind her, as if expecting someone to be following us. "I've seen her chop down trees and lug the remains clear across her backyard. Do you know what I think? I think maybe she killed Mr. Cadaver and chopped him up and buried him in the backyard." "Phoebe," I said. "Well, I'm just telling you what I think, that's all. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Mrs. Cadaver, and I wanted to believe that she was capable of killing her husband and chopping him into pieces and burying him in the backyard. And then I started thinking about the blackberries, and I remembered a time my mother and I walked around the ruins of the fields and the pastures and bybanks, picking blackberries. We did not pick them from the bottom of the vine or from the top. The ones in the bottom were for the rabbits, my mother said, and the ones at the top were for the birds. The ones at people height were for people. Lying in bed, remembering those blackberries, made me think of something else too. It was something that happened a couple of years ago on a morning when my mother slept late. It was at time she was pregnant. My father had already eaten breakfast, and he was out in the fields. On the table my father had left a single flower in each of the 2 juice glasses, a black-eyed Susan in front of my place and a white petunia in front of my mother's. When my mother came into the kitchen, she said, "Glory!" She bent her face toward each flower. "Let's go find him." We climbed the hill to the barn, crawled between the fence wires, and crossed the field. My father was standing at the far end of the field, his back to us, his hands on his hip, looking at a section of fence. My mother slowed down when she saw him. I was right behind her. It looked as if she wanted to creep up and surprise him. So I quieted too, caution in my steps. I could hardly keep from giggling. It seemed so daring to be sneaking up on my father, and I was sure my mother was going to throw her arms around him and kiss and hug him and tell him how much she loved the flower on the kitchen table. My mother always loved anything that normally grows or lives outdoors. Anything. Lizards, trees, cows, caterpillars, birds, flowers, crickets, toads, ants, pigs. Just before we reached my father, he turned around. He startled my mother and threw her off guard. She stopped. "Sugar," he said. My mother opened her mouth, and I was thinking, "Come on, throw your arms around him, tell him." But before she could speak, my father pointed to the fence and said, "Look at that, a morning's work." He indicated a new length of wire strung between two new posts. There was sweat on his face and arms. And then I saw my mother was crying. My father saw it too. "What?" he said. "Oh, you're too good, John. You're too good, and all you Hiddles are too good. I'll never be so good. I'll never be able to think of all the things." My father looked down at me. "The flowers," I said. "Oh," he put his sweaty arms around her. But she was still crying, and it wasn't what I had imagined it would be. It was sad instead of happy. The next morning when I went to the kitchen, my father was standing beside the table, looking at two small dishes of blackberries, still shining and wet with dew. One dish at his place and one at mine. "Thanks," I said. "No, it wasn't me," he said. "It was your mother." Just then she came in from the back porch. My father put his arms around her and they smooched, and it was all tremendously romantic. And I started to turn away, but my mother caught my arm. She pulled me to her and said to me, "Though it was meant for my father, I think." "See, I'm almost as good as your father," she said in a shy way, laughing a little. I felt betrayed, but I didn't know why. It is surprising all the things you remember just by eating a blackberry pie. Chapter 7. Illinois. Illinois. "Looky there," Gramps shouted. "The Illinois state line." He pronounced Illinois exactly the way everyone in Bybanks, Kentucky pronounced it. And hearing that Illinois made me suddenly homesick for Bybanks. "What happened to Indiana?" Gramps said. "Why, you gooseberry," Gramps said. "That's where we've been the past 3 hours, barreling through Indiana. You've been listening to the story of Phoebe and Plum missed Indiana. Don't you remember Elkhart? We ate lunch at Elkhart. Don't you remember South Bend? You took a pee in South Bend. Why, you missed the entire Hoosier state, you gooseberry." He thought this was very funny. Just then the road curved. It actually curved. This was a shock. And off the right was a huge, jing-bang mass of water. It was blue as bluebells that grow behind the barn in Bybanks, and that water just went on and on. It was all you could see. It looked like huge blue pasture of water. "Are we at the ocean, Grandmast? We're not supposed to be passing oceans, are we?" "You gooseberry, that's Lake Michigan." Gramps kissed his finger and put it against Gramps' cheek. "I sure would like to put my feet in that water," Gramps said. Gramps swerved across 2 lanes of traffic and into the exit ramp, and faster than you could milk a cow, we were standing barefoot in the cool water of Lake Michigan. The waves splashed up on our clothes, and the seagulls flew in circles overhead, calling in one great chorus, as if they were glad to see us. "Huzza, huzza," Gramps said, wriggling her heels into the sand. "Huzza, huzza." We stopped that night on the outskirts of Chicago. I looked around at what I could see of Illinois from the Howard Johnson Motel, and it might as well have been 7,000 miles from the lake. It all looked precisely like northern Ohio to me, with its flat land and long, straight roads. I thought that what a very long journey this was going to be. With the dark came the whispers, "Rush, hurry, rush." That night I lay there trying to imagine Lewiston, Idaho, but my mind would not go forward to a place I had never been. Instead, I kept drifting back to Bybanks. When my mother left for Lewiston, Idaho that April, my first thoughts were, how could she do that? How could she leave me? As the days went on, many things were harder and sadder, but some things were strangely easier. When my mother had been there, I was like a mirror. If she was happy, I was happy. If she was sad, I was sad. For the first few days after she left, I felt numb, non-feeling. I did not know how to feel. I could not find myself looking around for her to see that what I might want to feel. One day, about 2 weeks after she had left, I was standing against the fence watching a newborn calf wobble on its thin legs. It tripped and wobbled and swung its big head in my direction and gave me a sweet, loving look. Oh, I thought, I'm happy at this moment in time. I was surprised that I knew that this all by myself, without my mother there. And that night in bed, I did not cry. I said to myself, Salamanca Tree Hiddle, you can be happy without her. It seemed a mean thought, and I was sorry for it, but it felt true. In the motel, as I was remembering these things, Gram came and sat at the edge of my bed. She said, Do you miss your daddy? Do you want to call him? I did miss him, and I did want to call him, but I said, No, I'm fine, really. He might think I was a goose if I had to call him already. Okay, then, chickabiddy, Gram said, and she leaned over and kissed me. I could smell the baby powder she always used. That smell made me feel sad, but I didn't know why. The next morning when we got lost leaving Chicago, I prayed, Please don't let us get in an accident. Please let us get there in time. Gramps said, At least it's a mighty fine day for a drive. When we finally found a road heading west, we took it. Our plan was to curve across the lower part of Wisconsin, veer into Minnesota, and barrel straight through Minnesota, South Dakota, and Wyoming, sweep up into Montana, cross the Rocky Mountains into Idaho. Gramps figured it would take us about a day in each state. He didn't intend to stop much until we reached South Dakota, and he was really looking forward to South Dakota. We're going to see the Badlands, he said. We're going to see the Black Hills. I didn't like the sound of either of those places, but I knew why we were going there. My mother had been there. But the bus that she took out to Lewiston stopped in all the tourist spots. We were following along her footsteps.